Prajem príjemný večer, vážené dámy, vážení páni a priatelia slobodnej spoločnosti s trhovým kapitalizmom a univerzálnymi pravidlami. Za Konzervatívny inštitút Milana Rastislava Štefánika vás vítam už na 54. prednáške v rámci programu Conservative Economic Quarterly Lecture Series, oceneného v roku 2009 v kategórii Etika a hodnoty Templeton Freedom Award. A ako sme vám avizovali, tak po prednáške bude aj čaša vína, ktorou si môžeme symbolicky pripiť na 300. nedožité výročie narodenia Adama Smitha. Na úvod chcem tradične poďakovať partnerom, bez podpory a pomoci, ktorých by sme nemohli zorganizovať dnešnú prednášku. A to nadácii Petra Banka, dvom spoločnostiam obchodujúcim s cennými papiermi Across Private Investment a European Investment Center, Republikovej únii zamestnávateľov, advokátskej kancelárii MST Partners, Students for Liberty, týždenníkom Trend a Týždeň, denníku Hospodárske noviny, internetovým portálom Aktuality.sk a Energie.sk, slovenskej tlačovej agentúre SITA a nakoniec aj hotelu Park in Radisson Danube. Dnes môžeme privítať medzi nami ďalšieho vzácneho hostia, profesora Daniela Kleina, ktorý bude prednášať práve o nadčasových, ale aktuálnych, ale aj neraz nepochopených myšlienkach Adama Smitha. Vyvracia časté nepochopenia v diele Adama Smitha v podobe vnímania len cez vlastný záujem a v znevažujúcej podobe ako egoistického človeka konajúceho na úkor iných, alebo v podobe protirečení medzi knihami Adama Smitha, Teória mravných citov a Vládcov národov, pričom upozorňuje vo svojich prácach, že práve medzi týmito dvoma knihami nie je nejaký rozpor. Naopak, vyjadrujú symbiózu, vôbec celé dielo Adama Smitha vyjadruje symbiózu medzi princípmi trhu, ktorý je vedený tou metaforou neviditeľnej ruky a tiež vlastným záujmom. A na druhej strane princípmi morálky, ktoré sa opierajú o ďalšiu metaforu, ktorou je nestranný pozorovateľ a zároveň pohľad alebo teda zdôrazňovanie dobročinnosti, empatie, najmä od tej osobnej roviny. A vždy teda rešpektujúc pravidlá slobody a spravodlivosti. Dnes, aj keď vďaka myšlienkám Adama Smitha žijeme v najlepších historických časoch a za posledných 200 rokov sme enormne zbohatli celá ľudstvo, spoločnosť, tak môžeme pozorovať, že dochádza k tomu, že ľudia nedôverujú týmto princípom, nejakých stále viacej podkopávajú a dokonca oživujú ducha kolektivizmu v protismere k týmto základom dnešnej spoločnosti. A preto to považujem celú túto dnešnú tému za nanajvyš dôležitú a bude od nej prednášať úplne top expert vo svete. Predtým, ako mu odovzdám slovo, ešte by som chcel povedať niekoľko slov, niekoľko vied z jeho odborného životopisu. Daniel Klein je profesor ekonómie na George Mason University, čo je univerzita v USA, kde je asi najväčší podiel klasicko-liberálnych profesorov, akademikov v celom svete. Takže z tejto univerzity máme aj najviac profesorov na svojich prednáškach. A na tejto univerzite spolu s Erikom Matsonom vedú program o Adamovi Smithovi. Spolu tiež vedú vydavateľstvo CL Press a redigujú mesačník o diele Adama Smitha Just Sentiments. Daniel Klein je tiež šéfredaktorom odborného časopisu Econ Journal Watch a držiteľ mnohých ocenení. Napríklad ocenenia The Independent Review z roku 2009 za najlepší článok v histórii, ktorý vyšiel v tomto časopise. Daniel Klein je autorom mnohých textov o Adamovi Smithovi. Príkladom je jeho posledná kniha Smith's Morals, Smithovská morálka. Pričom napríklad nositeľ Nobelovej ceny Vernon Smith, zhodou okolností ďalší Smith, povedal o tejto knihe, že 3 storočia po svojom narodení nebol Adam Smith nikdy relevantnejší a inšpirujúcejší ako dnes. A eseje Dana Kleina sprostredkovajú túto inšpiráciu prístupným spôsobom, ktorý posilňuje význam tohto najväčšieho učenca. A v tomto roku Daniel Klein napísal skôr, ale vyjde mu ďalšia kniha, ktorá v slovenčine by som ju preložil ako hlavné pojmy smithovského liberalizmu a v nej robí z Adama Smitha ústrednú postavu tzv. Konzervatívneho liberalizmu. Možno, že aj o tom povie v prednáške, uvidíme. V každom prípade zdôrazňuje spojenectvo klasického liberalizmu a konzervativizmu, ktoré sú opreté o politickú filozofiu, politickú ekonómiu slobody, takže naozaj nie je štát. A toto aj ja považujem za dôležité pri obrane pred ľuďmi, ktorí prenášajú do spoločnosti kolektivistické nejaké predstavy. Pevne verím, že všetci máte vypnuté alebo stíšené svoje mobilné telefóny, aby sme neboli rušení počas prednášky. A teraz už odovzdám slovo pánovi profesorovi, aby odprezentoval svoju prednášku. Floor is yours.
Hey everybody, it's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me here. It's a great opportunity. I'm very grateful and admiring of everything that Peter and your team does. And it's a great honor. So, well, we get this up. If you go to Edinburgh in Scotland and you go to Smith's tombstone, it's going to say he was born on June 5th, 1723. And today is June 5th, right? 2023. So is today? Well, you know, I don't know if you know this, but in 1752 they shifted the calendar 11 days. Don't ask me why. I'm a little mystified by that myself. But so I think if we go by our sense of a year, which is 365 and a quarter days, it's actually going to be on June 16th, our day, our time. That'll be like that many days since he was born. So close enough. Happy birthday, Adam Smith. Let me also say that you should, I mean, I would like to present myself to you, first of all, as someone who interprets Adam Smith and does scholarship on Adam Smith. So I tell you, this is what Adam Smith thought, but I actually am so Smithian that I'm also pretty much always ready to say, and that's how you should think. So I'm like, not just an intellectual historian about Smith, I'm also like, I believe in this guy. So just so you know what you're getting, I believe in this guy. So I got a whole mess of slides and some quotations I'm not going to read, so don't freak out when you see all this stuff. I'm going to try to make sense as we go and try to keep it not too lengthy, so we have plenty of time for discussion.
Don't worry, you don't see.
What's that? It's off. Is it going to come on? Yeah. I need to show you a picture. So let's start with some questions. Anyone got any questions so far? No. Yeah, that's great, thanks. So this here is a, let's see. I don't carry this thing, is that right? I like to move around maybe a little bit. This here, this is GDP per person from 1100 to oh. Hello? Yeah. This is great. That's 100. That's 1,000 to 1750. That's 1,000 to 1750. And you can see it's going up a little bit. And then, bang, bang. And that's the world is one, Europe and the U.S. Well, any of them, it's like dramatic. Like, what happened? What happened? That's a very good question. What happened right after around like Smith's time, and just after and continuing after Smith's time? Smith died in 1790. So what happened? And in a way, I actually want to tell you, Smith happened. Instead of shit happened, Smith happened. What happened here wasn't some particular technological discovery. You know, it wasn't. It was moral and political, and the political changes depend on moral changes. And so, kind of the theme of what I have to say is the theme of moral authorization. Certain things needed moral authorization to make them okay. God says, okay, go forth and do that if you like. And in particular, there's two moral authorizations I'm going to be focusing on. One of them is to entrepreneurs, workers, just regular everybody. Honest income, pursuing honest income is okay. And if you make more of it, that's okay. And if you make a lot of it, that's okay. It's actually, God actually approves, okay? Or at least he doesn't disapprove. And it is a God world. I mean, it's all Christendom here. And Adam Smith's coming right out of the ark of Christian philosophy, natural theology, and he talks of God in the theory of moral sentiments openly and explicitly. He affirms divine providence. So the first moral authorization is telling everybody it's okay to pursue honest income. And once they get that big green light, they start figuring out new ways, new lines of work. Oh, I see. Far out. Thanks. And what comes out of this in particular, it's not just working harder, working longer hours. It's also innovation. I got a new idea that I think will make a lot of honest income. And we got a big green light here for that. That's what happened. That's one of the things that happened. And the other thing that happened is that Smith and others persuaded lawmakers, the aristocrats, let people do that. So it's also policy changes. Like, don't clamp down. This is actually good for the country. It's actually good for your own coffers, your tax collectors, because it's a bigger pie and you guys take a certain percentage, and so actually the state's going to be wealthier too. So there's policy change in the liberal direction, liberalizing, and there's invigoration of economic activity, and both of these depended on moral authorization. Moral authorities are vital to all of us and very fundamental in society. And one of the great troubles we have in this world today is that we don't have moral authorities. I mean, the ones who set themselves up or that get a lot of attention are so often not actually worth heeding, so often. So that back then, though, Smith's first book is a book about virtue.
And he published this first in 1759 and got very famous and respected. And then a couple years later, he got appointed at Glasgow as a professor. It's like, oh yeah, he's actually a great moral person. He thinks about moral theory. He thinks about virtue. So we kind of trust that guy as a moral authority. And then in 1776, he says, allow every man to pursue his own interest, his own way, upon the liberal plan of equality, liberty, and justice. So there it's like a moral leader is morally authorizing this. It's not just any guy. It's not Thomas. It's not someone that just wrote a clever book about economics. It's an important moral authority. And so we got this bang of the great enrichment, as Deirdre McCloskey calls this blade of the hockey stick here. So these are his years, and here's what I just said, allowing every man to pursue his own interest upon the liberal plan of equality, liberty, and justice. And Smith and his group were the first to christen that philosophy of liberty liberal. The word liberal before the 1770s did not have a political meaning. The word liberal just meant generous and kind of becoming as a virtue in your personal, private activity. And it was only then that these guys christened what they were favoring liberal, with words like liberal plan, liberal system, liberal policy, liberal principles. So the first liberalism is Smithian liberalism. And that's really the anchor that gives rise to like a 100-year period of classical liberalism. So when you hear people come from the United States and elsewhere and they talk about the left as liberal, that's different. That's different. That's not the first and the original, and in my view, the best liberalism. So here's just another example where he uses liberal system, and he repeats it, this liberal system, because he's sending the message, this is the word we're calling this here. And here are the different 2 grams, liberal principles, liberal policies, liberal ideas, liberal systems, liberal government, liberal plan. And this is the n-gram viewer, where it's the percentage of all 2 grams in millions of scanned books. And you can see that this is Adam Smith, William Robertson, and some of their other friends, and then that catches on in Britain. And then later you get the ism added for liberalism. But that's what they're building. That's why it was called liberalism, because we had this idea of liberal. Now, it's important always, Smith writes about what the policymaker, what the guy who makes law should do in policy. And he's saying, generally speaking, allow people to pursue their own interests their own way. In other words, leave them alone and let them do their thing. Now, that presupposes a lawmaker. That presupposes a government. And on the matter of, well, what kind of government should we have? Should we have democracy or aristocracy? Should we have how many houses? All those different questions of political science, if you want to call it that. He doesn't really deal with that directly. So he takes for granted these things. Polity just means like a political community. The top polity is the nation state. So if you want to just think of the nation state, integrated, stable, functional. So he's taking that more or less for given, like supposing that's the case, what should those lawmakers, those legislators then do? And they should do what I showed you here a second ago, this, basically. So we should always bear in mind that this is supposing a stable, integrated, functional polity, and in his day in Britain, that existed. to a great extent. And it was actually pretty new to Britain. You know, you think of the Glorious Revolution in 1688, 1689, that's very significant, but it's still a couple of decades before they, you know, keep out the Jacobites, you know, the people who want to restore the Stuarts, and so on. And it's only really into Smith's time that you have these kind of assumptions, and then Smith's like, okay, I'm just going to assume that, and now I'm going to say what good policy is. And so we got a nation state, we got a stable nation state, we got a, you know, Britain's an island, that helps, right? That really helps, because it makes it more clear what your nation is. And we got kind of a unified language and so on. And so let's make it a liberal nation state. And this picture, which is due to my friend Eric Madsen, represents these two moral authorizations. So I'm going to show you this picture a couple times. And so you have kind of Smith, the philosopher, and well, over there is the moral authorization of honest income, something you can focus on, your own income. And so Eric calls that focalism, kind of the moral authorization of focusing on the stuff that you have knowledge and control over. Everyone is responsible to serving the greater good. But how are we effective in serving the greater good? There's all these concerns and problems throughout the world. What can I effectively contribute to? The ones close to me, the ones where I have knowledge, the ones where I have relationships and expectations and effectiveness. And that means close to home. Once you get farther away from yourself and your family and your friends and your community, you're not effective. And so no matter how benevolent you are, you can't actually do much good, okay? Ought, the word ought implies can. And can implies knowledge and trust and relationships. So where can you do good? Well, maybe you can work hard and make stuff that people actually want to buy, right? And then you get rewarded with honest income. You know, so that's the moral authorization down there of pursuing honest income and focusing on kind of like your own stuff. And then that invigorates economic activity, like we were saying, with innovation and so on. And this moral authorization is saying to the policymaker, let people do that. Laissez-faire. Allow every man to pursue his own way, and that comes back into liberalized policy, and so you get the great enrichment, like we saw. These are the two moral authorizations on the left and the right there. And that's kind of, in some sense, the big story I have for you. Now, we're talking about Adam Smith. I actually believe that this Christianity thesis is very important. You could cite Larry Seatentop on this, so it's actually a very long story. But I actually think that Christianity is quite revolutionary, and that, of course, comes out of Judaism, which is related and part of, also, therefore, part of the big story. P.J. Hill talks about the Judeo-Christian conception of the human being, and that all this leading to the really making possible. It's not necessarily leading, but it makes possible the liberal idea. So here's another kind of narration of this emergence of liberalism, with Smith then at the arc, or the crest, in 1776, starting with the printing press. You could think that we start with kind of traditional society. And then the printing press comes. I think the printing press is an important starting point, because that busts interpretation of the world wide open. And all of a sudden people can kind of compete with their different interpretations of things. That, of course, led to secession and conflict among the churches, and war, and all sorts of crazy stuff. And finally, a notion among governments that this ain't working out. Maybe we need to back off on the way we used to lead traditional society. Governments used to lead the highest things along with the church in traditional society. And we got a kind of start of the modern era, you could say, and a kind of inversion of government's focus. So what do I mean by inversion? And this inversion leads to what I'm going to call here natural jurisprudence, and then finally to Adam Smith and so on. So Melzer explains this in his book, and I won't read all this, but whereas in traditional society, government kind of leads and tends the highest things, the things that mean the most to us. And it kind of points the way and organizes the community and collective experience and leads them in what is most meaningful, you could even say. The high things. After all this conflict with the wars, the Reformation, the wars of religion, this new philosophy came that said, hey, look, maybe what the government ought to do, instead of leading up here, is that it ought to focus on down there, on the base, and protect against the worst evils. In other words, not give us the great goods, the great higher goods, but protect us against the low evils of like people stealing from us, chaos, violence, and so on. And so we've got a new focus. This is quite clear, and I would say profound, in these centuries, talking about, say, the 16th, 17th centuries, on studying rights, basic rights and duties, to create, if you like, a basic operating system, okay, which then emerges as the liberal plan, which does have certain dangers, to be sure, but is basically proceeding, saying this is the way to go. It stops focusing on the higher things. Liberalism is not good on telling you how to find meaning in life. And if you treat liberalism as a religion, as a guide to what is meaningful, I think you'll be very disappointed with it. So that's not really what it does, but it does monkey to some extent in the higher things space by saying, look, don't go over here, which is to say a very anti-liberal big government philosophy. Like if you're higher things, and a lot of people today, especially on the left, I think look to government as a kind of religion substitute, and they want the government to kind of lead the higher things in life, and liberalism is saying, no, don't go there. That's kind of off. But in terms of what's left, that's your responsibility. Is it going to be your family, your work, your friendships, your art, your learning, everything in your own personal life? That's all going to be your highest things. We don't have answers for you for that. That's your responsibility. And a lot of people don't like that responsibility, so they glom onto the collectivism, unfortunately, in my view, because I think that hurts everybody else. So liberalism doesn't forsake the higher things, but on the other hand, it doesn't actually give you kind of an answer. It doesn't really offer an answer for them. And it says it's better than the alternatives. And it's the goodness of the whole which has to justify this sense of it being better. And that's just the way human life is. So these guys, like these, were doing this analyzing the lower things, the basic operating system, the basic rights and duties in jurisprudence. Okay, and so this jurisprudence is actually a really important part of the story. And these are some of the big figures of it. Hume is also part of this story. he's not necessarily thought of as a natural law theorist, but as Stephen Buckle and others explain, Hume is a natural law theorist. He's just a kind of a very creative and original one. And so another way to look at these decades, or these centuries I should say, is that you've got your jurisprudence and political theory guys, you got Hume and Smith, they're buddies, and Hume and Smith basically think alike. You could almost think of them as a team. Smith makes the word liberal the name, and then if you like, you could project liberal back and onto the other guys who are part of this whole arc, and call them perhaps proto-liberals. So that's just another way of kind of thinking about this whole long development. So this first book is about virtues. It's about virtues you are to practice. And the really beautiful and becoming virtues are generosity, friendship, magnanimity, hospitality, temperance, and so on. Beneficence. But there's one virtue that's very special, and it relates to all this jurisprudence stuff I just talked about. Oh, I'm not there yet. Okay, I'm going to just do this real quick. I just want to say, he's got this whole impartial spectator approach. This is kind of a cool picture that I won't take time to explain. This here is different men within the breast. That's your conscience. And you got to develop that. You see, we kind of start as a frog. And you got to develop that. And that up there is God, or a God-like being. And the man within the breast is the representative of God in each of us. Not necessarily a good representative, but it's all we got to work with. So do follow your conscience. But that's one picture. And then another picture is similar, again, with God or joy. I kind of also work with an allegorical, godlike being I call joy, just in case you're not necessarily strictly theistic. And this is like a similar kind of progression of impartial spectators. We can come back to that, but that's not what I'm going to be focusing on today. I want to come back now to this special virtue, commutative justice. It's mere justice, it's basic justice, the most sacred laws of which guard the person's life, property, promises due. Life, person, property, and contract, like if someone makes a contract with you. So those are the things covered by this important kind of justice. This is the basic operating system. Justice, there's different kinds of justices. This one's called commutative by Adam Smith. And this is like the jurisprudence stuff. And the jurisprudence people said, okay, there's different countries, different peoples, different societies in different places on the earth and in different times in history. And if we look at any one of them, we can think, what did they consider to be stuff? Like person, property, promises due. Like what counts as those? And that's what jurisprudence dealt with sometimes. And what made it one person's rather than another person's? Or was it nobody's? Maybe it was unowned, like a resource that's unowned, like a commons. And then, very importantly, what counts as messing with it? Okay? What are the forms of messing with it? What is fraud? What is trespass? What is nuisance? Right? And so on. So that's all jurisprudence. And although the answers vary in history, there's a uniformity across history. And that's that, like, whatever people's notions of stuff and messing with were, for that society to go forward and grow and even survive, people had to not mess with other people's stuff too much. So there's a kind of uniformity that societies that survive and get recorded in history have this kind of law of basic not messing with other people's stuff. Otherwise, it wouldn't be surviving. And so the jurisprudence people worked that stuff out before the Wealth of Nations in the jurisprudence, and then the child of that comes liberalism. So what I'm trying to emphasize here is that liberalism comes out of this whole broad societal shift that says, look, government, we're getting too complicated. Society is getting too big and too complicated. This is after 1440, after the printing press. For the government to try to make us all this local, traditional community. And so what do? When they try different governments have different ideas, different leaders have different ideas, then they go to war. We don't want that. So the new idea was, let's focus on protecting the basics and let people do their own pursuit, okay, with others not messing with their stuff, and in the political relationship, the superior-inferior relationship, liberty. The idea of liberty, modern idea of liberty, really emerges, which you can see in Smith is a flip side of this justice, commutative justice I just spoke of. So this is the lineage of all this. And Smith realizing that we need a whole public philosophy, a whole public program of liberalism that comes out of it. So that's the spine of liberalism 1.0, commutative justice and liberty. It's not the heart, it's not the head, it's the spine. And you know, if you don't have a spine, you're just a flaccid mass, and things are going to degenerate. That's what I'm afraid might be happening to us. So more Wealth of Nations morally authorizes the pursuit of honest income, and it morally authorizes this presumption of liberty. You can kind of think of this, of the other thing in 1776, the Declaration of Independence, where Thomas Jefferson talked about life, liberty. That's commutative justice, that's the lower things, protecting those, securing those, not treading, don't tread on me, great American saying, don't tread on me. Why? So we can pursue happiness. And we're all going to do that somewhat differently, certainly. And liberalism doesn't pretend to really point you in that pursuit. And so all this happened and we got the great enrichment. And so like I say, from my friend Eric here, he published this paper in this journal, and he also did another thing where he did this picture. And so here again is this moral authorization to the aristocrats, the lawmakers, the people in parliament saying, hey guys, liberalize. It's actually good for everybody. It's actually the generous and liberal, as in generous, as in decent, liberal thing to do, is let people pursue their own happiness. And so they listened to him. You know, Adam Smith ingratiated himself to the aristocrats. He made friends with the aristocrats. He was a friend to the politicians and tried to guide them and persuade them. And they listened to him. That was one of the beauties of aristocracy, is that there was very few people who ruled. And therefore, the people who ruled, first of all, felt a responsibility for ruling. And secondly, everybody else, they were like, those bastards rule us, and we don't trust them for a second. So they can't be propagandized too much and brainwashed because they think, oh, we're the rulers, because you know we're democracy and we rule, and so like, why should we have restrictions on the rulers? Like in democracy, why should we have restrictions on government? We're the government. Why would we want to restrict ourselves? We want to be able to do whatever's good. But in an aristocracy, where 95% of the people are like, those bastards have their spurs in our side. They're riding us. We want restrictions on them. And so the Times, in a number of ways, actually made this liberal idea kind of attractive to different parts of society and makes sense. Okay. So this is the obvious system of natural liberty. It's very clear how he kind of presents it. This is about the focalism. Every individual is continually exerting himself to find out the most advantageous employment for whatever capital he can command. But the study of his own advantage naturally, or rather necessarily, leads him to prefer that employment which is most advantageous to the society. He's assuming that the guy makes his money honestly. That's within the liberal plan of equality, liberty, and justice. And so you get rich by serving other people, because your money depends on voluntary participation by the people you deal with and trade with. So this is what Smith was explaining. And so the man intends only his own security. This is now the private investor. And by directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, because that'll bring him the most income, he intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. And I won't read the rest of it. So this focalism works out because of the dynamics of the system. If you want better housing, let people build their own housing. Let them innovate. Let them make their own deals. Let them rent out their units. Let them find what other people are happy to pay for. Same thing in childcare. Same thing in any labor market. Same thing in agriculture. So the liberal plan was true then, is true now. And I'm not saying like in every single case we should have absolute laissez-faire. And Smith didn't say that. He did make exceptions. But the presumption should be in favor of that. And if you want to make an exception to that, the burden of proof should be on you. Okay? Just like with the presumption of innocence. Like let's say I'm the defendant. And let's say my wife here in the first row is the prosecutor. And believe me, this is not so far from reality. So she has the burden of proof to show that I'm guilty. Okay? It's not like I have to prove I'm innocent. You've got to prove I'm guilty, honey. Anyway, so that's the idea of the presumption of liberty. The Smith's saying we should have a presumption of liberty. If you want to make an exception, you really got to mount a good case and overcome the burden of proof. And so that's this. We can talk about the dynamism involved in liberalism and what Smith thought about that. That's an interesting topic, but I'll move on. And so here's the liberal vision of the nation state, wealth, and the division of labor. The division of labor faces obstructions from the government. So the liberal plan is about removing obstructions so people can make more mutually gainful trades in all those lines of activity. It's kind of the invisible hand outcome that a spontaneous order comes from this, so that it makes the good of the whole. It improves the good of the whole. Again, the focalism and presumption of liberty are the two moral authorizations. And let me just see what else I have here. The book, The Wealth of Nations, was quite comprehensive review of policies, so he gives like a very broad sweeping review and creates a kind of perspective for the modern nation state, which he wants to make the liberal nation state. Now, about the word liberal, so like I said, Smith and his friends first defined political liberal, and it was that till about here. And then the Liberal Party in Britain changed its nature. It changed its thinking. It was still called the Liberal Party, but it started to become more collectivist. And then it started talking about new liberalism. And that's the blue line. And then people said, oh, we got this new liberalism. I mean the old liberalism. And so people also talked about old liberalism. So this is when like the two different meanings started up, and we've been living with ever since, you see. And so there's these different meanings of liberal today. Here's like three faces. There's Adam Smith and David Hume, liberalism 1.0. Sometimes liberalism just is associated with democracy, but then there's modern, particularly North American, Canada, the United States, where liberal so often means more government, the governmentalization of social affairs. These are some of the new liberal guys. See, these guys wrote about new liberalism, okay? And then these guys, after that, are just a couple of the figures that are part of that lefty liberal. I'm just noting here that I think Smith and Hume and Burke were very liberal about what the policies of a nation should be, but when it came to screwing with the nation, or the polity, they were rather conservative. I can go into this, but this kind of means that I think their liberalism is a conservative kind of liberalism. And so I think it's worth in terms of conservative liberalism. And so we should read Adam Smith today, both books, because I think what he was teaching and what, believe me, he profoundly influenced our history, our world. I'm not kidding. He's really at the crest of this long arc since the printing press. And you could even go back to Christianity, but he's really at the crest of it. And there's a very lively and important conversation about the true Adam Smith. So we should really think about this because it's a way of thinking about the whole history of who we are, how we got here, where we should be going or have been going. So all the big important questions, which I think we rather desperately actually need to understand better. I think that's about it. Yeah, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Ďakujem za podnetnú prednášku. Pevne verím, že postupne ste si premysleli aj otázky, pretože teraz práve je ten čas na diskusiu. Predtým teda, ako niekto si už naozaj reálne premyslí, tak chcem povedať pár bodov do pravidiel na diskusiu, takže kto má záujem, poprosím, aby sa prihlásil. Mikrofón poputuje k nemu a potom, aby povedal, či sa spýta v angličtine alebo slovenčine, aby sa mohol pán profesor pripraviť a teda nahodiť si na tlmočenie. A potom využite, prosím vás, maximálne 2 minúty na svoju otázku alebo konkrétny námet, aby vyšlo času na čo najviac záujemcov. Takže nech sa páči, kto má záujem o otázku, kto prvý bude ten odvážlivec, takže môžete sa prihlásiť. Vzadu vidím, nech sa páči.
All right, thank you for a great presentation. I enjoyed it. That's what I want to say. My question is, you mentioned that liberalism and cumulative justice are the spine for the functioning of the society, right? Are the keystone to the functioning of the society. My question is, you mentioned that in the modern world we're losing it and degenerating, which I do agree with. And my question is, in what aspects do you think this is truthful or more specific to the development of our modern society?
I'm sorry, this sounds like it's working. In what respects do I think that we're losing commutative justice and liberty? Is that the question?
Yeah.
I think it's very pervasive. I think that Slovaks, when they did their housing supply 100 years ago, faced much less restrictions than they do today, or in their child care, or in their labor relations. I'm guessing, I don't know Slovak history, but am I wrong? I mean, and now there's tons and tons of regulation. Things are very highly governmentalized, which sometimes means the government restricts what you and I could do in terms of both of us wanting to make a voluntary transaction or sale of some kind. heavily, maybe we have to be licensed, we have to be regulated, we have safety, we have workplace safety, we have environmental, this and that, all these things, and it's all around us. Plus, huge taxes, plus the government has its own printing press now, which back on the gold standard was a different story entirely. So the government has these huge sources of wealth, and then it creates these huge agencies who supply us with things, and those are big players in our society, which totally affect the world around us. So in that sense too, our world is highly governmentalized. You've got the Slovak government, you've got EU, right? Who knows what else we've got coming down the pike. So, I mean, we've gotten very far from a more liberal set of arrangements, I feel. Do you agree?
Oh yeah, I think the same thing, really.
Yeah. I mean, you and your neighbor, you still don't steal from each other. I don't think that people steal privately, you know. The subjects, the ruled citizens. I don't think commutative justice is doing badly there. I mean, crime is, I don't know if crime is up, it probably is up somewhat, but it's not the main problem. The main problem is that the government is doing all this vast stuff on a huge scale, which if your neighbor tried would be considered criminal, of course. But that's a special role of government. So, yeah. And we continue in a way to get, for the most part of the last, let's say 50 years, gotten richer, but there's also a moral and cultural side to this with the big government, with the governmentalization of things. And that's almost like as much as a concern as the material side of things, I feel. So, yeah, I'm not sure that things are actually improving on the whole.
All right, thank you.
Which social institutions do you consider the most important for natural liberty, for prosperity, from Adam Smith mission or from your point of view? What do you think? Which social institutions are the key for our current prosperity and liberty?
Okay. Yeah. Family, church, friendships, circles, if you want to call that an institution, you use the term institution, workplaces. So all of these are big parts of our selfhood, our meaning in life, and where I think pursuits of happiness, of meaning, are healthiest. Whereas government, I don't think it's healthy, generally speaking. I can elaborate on that. So, yeah, so, you know, and Smith said this in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. He said for people in what he called the lower and middling stations in society, and remember in his aristocratic day, the rich people were pretty much the rulers, the big landowners, and therefore the lords and people in parliament. And so he was saying the people below that is where morals kind of operates by an invisible hand, where honesty is the best policy and people learn to be virtuous. He said that in the superior stations, right, it's a different story. And he went on about that, where flattery and falsehood prevail, and that works under the different set of mechanisms and selection processes, and a lack of proper feedback. Feedback in a system, even of a system of morals, and of course in a system of economics with profit and loss, feedback is really important so that things correct, so that if people are doing something that's not good for the whole, that gets corrected somehow. Signals are sent back that somehow discouraged that way of doing things, that bad way of doing things. And you know, making losses in a business is a kind of signal to not do it that way. And in private relationships, the family, the workplace, the church, the friendship circle, feedback, you'll get feedback if you're not doing good to your fellows, right? But the government doesn't necessarily work by an invisible hand, unfortunately. And so that's one reason we don't want to put so much faith in it. We don't want it to try to somehow lead us. It might lead us very much down the wrong path, and then we cannot correct it when it leads. In fact, it'll never admit it was wrong. It'll lie till forever, right? And so it's a very different. So I would say those voluntary ones, and you know, the ones we most you know, networks, intellectual networks, and social groups, activities, sports.
From economic point of view, others, competition, private property, and prices.
Yeah. Prices and all that, I'm not sure you want to call prices an institution exactly, but markets. Let's say markets, okay. Markets as institutions, yeah, definitely.
Hello, thanks so much for the talk. And can we stand up or no? No. Okay. I also appreciate that you mentioned Larry Siedentop. I really like his work. So I have a question, kind of clarifying the difference between the new and old liberalism. To what extent then do you think that the new and old liberalism maps onto, say, economic liberalism versus, say, social liberalism, where economic liberalism emphasizes freedom to use your property how you want, and social liberalism emphasizes freedom to make the kinds of life choices or like pursue the kinds of ends that you want. And do you think that that kind of tension is present in Adam Smith?
I don't think that distinguishing them as economic freedom or liberty and social freedom or liberty actually is sound at all. And I think it's kind of a false presentation by the left people who call themselves liberal. Allowing every man to pursue his own interest, his own way, can be about any social aspect of his life, you know, in every single. So it doesn't mean economic at all. It's not narrowly economic. So it's just as social as anything else, allowing every man to pursue his own interest, his own way. Now they might say, oh, see, they really have a very different idea of liberty, and it goes more to sort of an Isaiah Berlin, positive and negative. And they're going to say, well, if people don't have enough resources or wealth, then they're not free. And I respect that it's a limitation, and in terms of capabilities, that's fine. I don't personally like using the word liberty that way. But, you know, some people have other meanings of the word. And I would say, well, you know, that's just worth arguing about. Does leaving people alone work out better for the whole and people's capabilities than the government doing the stuff that those folks want it all to do? And you know, I think you know what my answer is, and it's a conversation to have, and it's what politics is about. So I don't really see it as that's just their verbiage, in my view.
Okay, thanks.
Ďakujem pekne. I will ask my question in English. Thank you very much, Daniel, for your very interesting lecture. And I can imagine that for someone who is studying Adam Smith for all his professional life, it is very difficult to condense all his knowledge into 45 minutes. So thank you very much for that. You've done a very good job. You were talking about this governmental or governmentalization of social affairs as something that is sort of overriding this original notion of individual liberty and individual responsibility. But in my view, it unfortunately doesn't end there. After governmentalization of social affairs, we are facing intergovernmentalization of social affairs. So we are all facing now the issue of global problems, and they are expected to be solved by UN, by G20, by G7, and under very nice slogan of fighting against climate change and everything,
Yeah.
there is the old-fashioned socialism, even communism, coming back to the center of the policy making. So my question to you is, assuming that the Adam Smith will be reincarnating today, so, and he would be expected to write the Wealth of Nations today,
Yeah.
what the book would look like facing all these challenges that are limiting our individual liberty and responsibility.
Yeah,
Thank
that's
you.
a great question. And he certainly did not foresee or have to deal with supranational institutions like we are. Like I said, for him, the top polity was the nation state. End of story. I mean, there could maybe be some treaties and so on, but that was the top, and that was that. Now, what would he say and think about all this? I think he'd be horrified by it, honestly, and I think in a lot of ways he might come across as more of a nationalist than he did, because the same principle of focalism gets applied, and it doesn't work. You know, again, you want to morally authorize people to focus where they have some knowledge and responsibility, right? And some good incentives, and that's especially locally. And so you want them to look, you are part of the whole, so you want to let them make themselves and their circle better off, because that's part of making the whole better off. It's not you versus everyone else, it's you as part of the whole. And the further you get from your local, the worse your effectiveness is, and that applies here. And governments need to be rather organic institutions among people with some kind of, we hope, accountability, some kind of responsibility, some kind of actual benevolence towards other people, understanding of other people, feedback from constituents. And once you make the levels of government larger and larger, it becomes more and more meaningless and ridiculous, where it's just slogans and it's dicta from these organizations and follow the science. And so I think he'd be like, no, we shouldn't be letting our lives be so influenced. We should maintain more of that sovereignty and keep the top level at the nation state. So I think he would be pretty unsympathetic, and in terms of the philosophies we see coming out of those institutions, I think he would be fundamentally opposed to most of it. What do you think?
I'm just wondering that if you would put yourself into the shoes of the Adam Smith, please share us at least with the main chapters of that book of the World of Nations.
Yeah, yeah, it's doable.
It's not only about, you know, just saying, well, supranational level
Yeah.
is sort of not good for individual liberty, but what should we be doing about that? That's the big question.
Yeah, what can you ever do? Like I said, he managed to ingratiate himself with aristocrats and persuade them as a friend. And they liberalized partly because Adam Smith morally authorized, would have disapproved of them if they didn't listen to him more. And I don't know how we do that. but unless unless some people try, it's all. I don't have a good answer to that one.
Thank you. I will ask my question in English as well. As an expert on Adam Smith, and I'm not an expert, so that's what I wanted to ask, is you have mentioned that it is moral, according to the Smithsonian philosophy, to leave people alone to do whatever they want and to pursue their interests. However, that has its limits as well, and you have said that even, and I'm going to probably butcher the word, but laissez-faire is not applicable to everything. And you have mentioned that Adam Smith was a Christian, and his idea of morality came from the Christianism. And Christianism has a little different view on some of the things that are moral, and some of the things that you would say, well, let people do it. Christianism would say, but that's immoral. So from Smithsonian perspective, is it more moral to let people do whatever they want, even though from Christian perspective it would be considered immoral? Or is it more moral to let the government stop the people from doing it?
Good question. And there is a distinction there between it being immoral and being something that should be prohibited by the government. Just because the government allows something doesn't mean that the government or anybody else is declaring it morally okay. And if you try to prohibit and control everything you think is immoral, that's going to be a terrible, terrible mess. See, Smith said about that commutative justice that it is grammar-like, it's kind of precise and accurate, it's those lower things. But the other things that fill up morality are loose, vague, and indeterminate. They're like aesthetics. And you can't legislate that, necessarily. And you get into all sorts of troubles like they got into with the Reformation and the wars of religion when you try. So I think he would generally be opposed to trying to control even the things you and I and he would think are immoral. Generally speaking. That's not to say he wouldn't stand for some restrictions and maybe some things that just happen to be the law around him he wouldn't necessarily go to war on. That's why he's partly a conservative liberal. And there were certainly some things you could point to. For example, he very much endorsed laws against polygamy. I mean, it's a very historical discussion. But he's saying we never could have gotten to our modern liberal nation state if we didn't have laws against polygamy, for example. He also expresses, this kind of gets into the issue of abortion and whether that's a restriction on liberty, and if it's, do you as a pregnant woman have a contract, as it were, with your fetus? So are you breaking a contract if you have an abortion? So these are difficult issues, but I think he would be against like a radical pro-choice position. And I think it might even be not based on the liberty ideas, just somehow a broader. So, like I say, he's got his ideas, and sometimes he talks about, what the proper duties of the government are, so you kind of get almost a sense of an ideal where the government is limited to those proper duties. But he knows darn well that while that's some kind of ideal destination, we are actually here. And what he's really interested in is not like jumping to there, it's about going this way, rather than going that way. Like he wants to push in the right direction, he's not that focused on getting to that destination. So I think all those kind of arguments about the moral character of the society and what's traditional and accepted, I think he's quite willing to, he wasn't really a bomb thrower on those kinds of issues, yeah.
Hi, Professor Klein. So I have here lectures on jurisprudence, a posthumous book by Smith. And my question is, so we know Smith was writing a book prior to his death, and then he burned all the manuscripts, or all of the unpublished ones. And then we have some, posthumous books written by the students, or, from scribblers, students. And so how much do we actually miss Smith's book on like really his book on jurisprudence, on the state? How much this book is what he intended to write? So this is the factual question probably. And the motivation behind this is this Central European, that we are from the continent, and you usually impose liberalism from above on the continent, unlike in Anglo-Saxon countries. It's the historical thing. And even in Smith's time, contemporary economists here, they were top-down economists. And so how much, we want to, I mean, you are Anglo-Saxon culture, and this is a continental culture, more top-down, more state-oriented. So could you a little bit sell us Smith's message more in this top-down approach? Thank you.
The guy who's in charge of the top-down, that's what he should do, is liberalize, like in Singapore. I mean, that's the thing about Smith. It's not really about how the legislator or the rule maker or the policy maker got to be the policy maker. It's about what policy will actually be good for the whole, and Smith's advice is generally the liberal policy. So if rulemaking here is more top-down, we want to appeal to the rule makers to be more Smithian when they make their rules. I mean, does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. But doesn't it have something to do with our absence of the natural jurisprudence, the Grotius, or something?
Maybe just in terms of, at least historically, because the Anglo-Americans are going off the rails, especially in Britain, which is really so tragic. So maybe, we had, the Anglo sphere had that stronger commutative justice, allowing every man norms, right, ethos, and so the rulers understood that more, and they got it more, they did it more. So that helped. So, that if we don't, so we want that back, but I don't know what to do exactly about that either. To go to your other question about the jurisprudence, yeah, that's right. In the last paragraph of this book, from 1759, he started talking about jurisprudence at the end of this, which makes you realize how much these books flow together and are part of a single project. But he announced the project, and he said, in other works, I'm going to treat two things. One is about policy, like government policy, including government taxation and revenue. And the other one is going to be a book about jurisprudence and justice. And so that's what he wrote in 1759. And then in 1790, the year that he died, he put out a final edition of this, and he had a preface, a new preface to it. And he said, listen, I said this, those many years ago, and I've delivered on the one promise with the Wealth of Nations on policy and taxation and so on. And I haven't delivered on the other one, but I'll try to continue to do what I can. But as you say, he actually died just a couple of months after that final edition of this came out, and he burned all the material. So do we think that those student lecture notes, which are from like 1763, scribbled down in Glasgow classrooms, are comparable to what we would have expected? No, I don't think so at all. those are student lecture notes. And it's a big difference. And I think his thinking probably matured. He would have put a lot more polish and craftsmanship. Like if you compare, you know, how these two works read and how subtle and complicated they often are, especially this one. I don't think we can really think that it might give us some broad sense of some of the big themes he would have treated and how some of the historical perspective would have come in, but I think it's very far from being anything like these two. But it's very valuable. I mean, it's great just to see what he was telling his 17-year-olds. They were like teenagers in the classroom.
Thank you.
Thank you again for the presentation. In light of your first answer to the question, the first question, you were talking about the government and the government institutions just growing,
Yeah.
and their resources, everything, and in a bit of a negative, is a negative something. But my question would be whether you also see that the individuals, I would say, need for responsibility is also lacking in populations. I would not say just in Slovakia. And if that is the case, if you see that people are not really willing to take responsibilities as individuals, as for their families and so, how could we maybe support to reverse and to make them feel that they actually need to take responsibilities and this willingness and, in my words, not to be lazy?
Yeah. At the beginning, in the very first chapter of this book, he talks about the division of labor, and he talks about why divided labor, like when at a pin factory, one man pulls out the wire, the next one cuts it, the next one sharpens it or grinds it at the top for receiving the head. He says, why is the division of labor more productive and 10 men can make 40,000 pins, rather in a day? And one of the reasons is that when you practice something, you get better at it. Learning by doing. It's not even that like you're better at it naturally than I am. That might be true too. But if you practice it, you'll get better. If I practice it, I'll get better. Learning by doing. And I think that applies to responsibility. So how do you make people more responsible? You have to make them more responsible. You have to leave them responsible. You have to say, it's on you. So that's how they learn to be responsible, is by having responsibility. You see what I'm saying? You don't have to, yeah, we need the mic down here, thank you.
Yes, I see that, but I do not see it like the government took their availability of responsibilities.
It has in a large degree, and their parents too. They're infantilizing all of us to a great extent. And so partly if they have more responsible parents, that's part of parenting and the family upbringing, that it gets passed down.
Well, definitely we can say that, but as the time goes and we reach some new and just even modern era with all the opportunities, I would say there are even more and more opportunities to be responsible and to, make changes. So, and who is it to make changes? I do not think it will be government itself.
I didn't quite follow that last part. What would be some examples of these opportunities these new opportunities?
Well, even as the technologies advance.
Okay.
One example.
Yeah.
So I would just want to make the shift in conversation back to individuals, not just shaming the government, because it's again people working according to the
I completely agree. And but what do we do? Look, I kind of have the Adam Smith point of view of advising the policymaker. Maybe that's just my mentality. I'm not so much about advising someone as a parent. And that would be something to discuss too, right? And better or worse ways to do that. And I just think that from the policy, what I have to say to the policymaker is, if you want more responsible subjects, give them more responsibility. And I want a more responsible society, so that's also what I want him to do.
Hopefully there is a lot of us.
Thank you for your wonderful summary of Adam Smith's legacy. The fascinating thing is the kind of tipping point or the momentum, like why it was Adam Smith who kind of changed the course of then future in the late 18th century. There are writers like Kevin Kelly, who wrote the book What Technology Want, or Matt Ridley, who wrote a wonderful book called Evolution in Everything. And they write there, and many other writers too, that certain ideas and certain inventions came at a certain point of the, let's say, evolution of institutions, environment and stuff. In other words, you cannot speed it up or accelerate the momentum of when they appear. And it is both true for ideas and for inventions as well. So, for instance, we all know that the theory of evolution was not invented solely by Charles Darwin. There was also Alfred Russel Wallace, who independently came up with the same idea. Let's say the electric bulbs. It was not only Thomas Alva Edison who invented electric bulb. There were others like Brit Swan or Russian Lodygin and other 20 inventors at the same time, independently. So my question is, like, when those writers write that it is a kind of general pattern, that there are always at least two, maybe hundreds or thousands of people who independently came up with the same idea at the same time. Yeah. So usually the credit is given just to one person, one folk, let's say James Watt or Charles Darwin or Newton and many others. Who are the other folks who came with the same idea as Adam Smith did and who are not given the credit?
Okay, that's a great question. I'm not saying they're not given credit. First of all, his buddy, David Hume, is very, very important for this story and for Adam Smith himself. David Hume was 12 years older, and what he accomplished was tremendous. So he's very strongly part of, I feel, the British story of this. Who else would I especially point to in Britain on this? I guess it's some of the other Scots in particular that jump to my mind. They are not so well known. I don't think they're as good actually as Hume and Smith. Before Smith, there's Hutcheson, his teacher at Glasgow, who died in 1746, so he's a bit earlier. And I think he's great. And in France, there's a number of people who don't have the same cultural eminence that Smith had, or that Hume had, although Hume's eminence was kind of a controversial one. But Smith was more of a cultural royalty kind of guy, whereas if you point to somebody like Turgot or Gournay in France, it's not the same, really. And there are other folks in other countries I know less about, and there are folks from Scandinavia that I could tell you a little bit about. I don't know about the Czechs and the Slovaks. There may have been.
Was there anyone in America?
Well, Benjamin Franklin was pretty darn good. And of course, when things heat up, towards the war for independence, Americans really step up and start to, feel very important. And I think in political theory, not so much economics and stuff, but the Federalist Papers and the discussions. Thomas Paine, I'm not actually that big a fan of Thomas Paine. I like Burke better. So yeah, no, but they're sort of Brits, and they thought of themselves as Brits. They rebelled as Brits, like declaring their rights as Englishmen, not to be tread on in this way and governed in this way. But you're right that it's a very broad story. And Smith is, I do think Smith is actually at the crest. He's kind of the proper figure or symbol, I would say. But it's a very rich story, and I don't pretend to be expert in much of it. I study these guys a lot, and I don't read other languages, so yeah, that's a good question.
Thank you. So I work at the government at an analytical institute, and we are trying to give some feedback on policies, whether they work as intended or not. And I was thinking about your ideas for policymakers to try to give more responsibility to people, but I was thinking how that would work in practice, because in practice, policymakers try to give more responsibility, for example, by increasing bureaucratic responsibilities of firms, or by increasing paperwork necessary, or, for example, by having workfare programs, which in the case of Slovakia, my colleagues have shown that it doesn't work as intended. So I was just, my question is, like, what, maybe to tell more precisely how you envision this responsibility.
Or how to persuade rule makers to give people more responsibility. I mean, the bureaucrats, they're imposing certain requirements on the firms to report certain things and do certain things, and the idea of leaving more responsibility would be not to require necessarily those things, and not to even be that involved, in some sense just to step back. That's, I think, really the broad idea. How to persuade and make the case for that is very difficult. One reason there's all this emphasis on letting people do their own thing is because that's where the knowledge is. It's very local and very personal and circumstantial. And to say that, oh, we up here in this government office have studied the results, and we can tell you how it worked out and how it would have worked out in a different way with a different policy, and therefore evaluate the policy that we pursued, that whole empirical investigation is really very iffy. It's for the same reason that you shouldn't try to control people, that you really can't know exactly what the whole consequences of any of this is. I mean, you can point to certain things, like, oh, look, the price of sugar is much higher because you've restricted sugar. But, people can say other things about, well, this way these farms stayed in business and they bought things, and so that area of the country didn't get depopulated, and, you start getting into what counts and how you add things up. But in the end, it does come back to broader philosophical convictions or principles, I would almost say. And that's one of the ironies and difficulties in running a research institute or think tank that argues, let's say, for liberal policy, is that every study, in a sense, says the same thing. it gets repetitive. It's like, please leave people alone. Like, how much expertise does it really take to repeat, let the market decide? You know, every single paper and study could be, the government's doing all this stuff. Let the market decide. Leave people alone and let them make their own deals, figure things out for themselves. And I actually believe that that's generally the good advice. But to sort of pretend to know, oh, this is exactly what happened as a result of this policy, and this is what would have happened if they didn't do it, that's like kind of fraudulent, I would say. You don't think so? Yeah, what do you say? Yeah.
I think if you can look at this graph and say that something positive happened, then why government cannot do a similar thing with other statistics? So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's the whole question about what is the cause of that. And I'm giving you a story that gives you my explanation. Other people will give you other explanations, like science, for example, the growth of science and technology.
Hi, thank you for your lecture. You just mentioned it's often optimal for the government to step back. I'm wondering whether you think it might be possible, either in theory or in practice, to have policies that both expand the role of government in some sense and enhance liberty. Examples I could think of that some people might argue do that would be things like the provision of universal health insurance, where it might increase labor mobility. You may not have to worry about not having employer-sponsored insurance and so on. So I'm just wondering whether you think this combination is ever possible.
I'm very skeptical, and I don't think it works out that way. And I think the more you governmentalize social affairs, the more it doesn't work out well and like promised at all. So, I mean, that's my reading of human experience in countries, across time, across countries, and you know. If people want all these different kind of flexibilities, securities, low prices, why don't you let people sort themselves and pursue those things and let people respond to the demand for all those different things that you say people want, to find mutual gains, which means honest income, as well as just doing good and having the good feeling of doing good. I mean, why does the government need to really do this?
Can I continue?
Yeah.
In some cases, you may have market failures. So in the case of health insurance, for instance, you may have adverse selection. You may have markets that don't exist. You may have prices that are higher than they would otherwise be without some sort of, intervention. It may not even necessarily be government intervention, but I can think of, situations where markets that usually work very well may not work fantastically in all circumstances.
I know that markets have limitations, and knowledge often is fragmented, asymmetric, and so forth. Does the government have the knowledge that the markets lack? Do they have better? When the government wants knowledge, what do? They ask the companies. They ask the regulated people. If anyone has any knowledge, it's going to be them. And so they're actually dependent upon them, and then you get capture theory of the regulation, and it's the best. Just because the market can't do something doesn't mean the government can do it. I mean, let's talk about government failures. Let's talk about what government doesn't do right. Let's talk about the lack of information and knowledge by the government and misaligned incentives by the government and the lack of correction mechanisms in the government sector. So, it's like the old story of, the emperor hearing an opera singing contest, and the first one comes in and starts caterwauling, and it sounds terrible. He says, quiet, quiet, stop her, I can't listen to any more. The prize goes to the next contestant. Well, maybe the next contestant's even worse, right? It could be even worse. So that's how I see it. And I think that's how Adam Smith sees it. He does not see markets as like so necessarily perfect or delivering happiness. Happiness is, again, mostly in your own hands. And so that's another thing about liberalism is that, and maybe one reason it declined at the end of the 19th century, is that people were expecting more happiness. So, you know, Britain became a fairly liberal country. So it was kind of like a liberal, quite liberal place, let's say in 1870. And people woke up and said, you know what? I'm still not happy. I'm still not happy. You guys said liberalism would make me happy. And so then they felt like unsatisfied and started searching for some higher meaning and higher thing. But doesn't mean they're going to get something better, and I don't think they got something better. They turned to collectivism. They turned to Fabianism and new liberalism. And all this stuff was spread throughout Europe and grew and led to world wars and totalitarianism, fascism. That was going to provide, we're going to be fused together, and that'll provide us meaning. That'll give you what you were missing under liberalism. We're not in the band anymore. Our ancestors, your ancestors, my ancestors, 10,000 BC lived in a little band of 40 people, a hunter-gatherer band. And that's still in our genes. But we're not in the band anymore. And when we try to recreate the band fulfillment and experience by politics in the modern world, it doesn't work like that. And just like your healthcare plan isn't going to work very well. And so we're not in the band anymore. So we can't hope to recapture that organic life where everyone we knew us. Everyone we loved us. We did things together. We knew who we were helping. And we were very knowledgeable about the good of the whole, because the whole was just the 40 of us. And we lived it together every day. And so we actually knew what the good of the whole was. And today, the good of the whole is all of humankind, including future generations. And we don't know that. And so we shouldn't pretend to plan society as though we're going to be capturing some specific goals for the whole of humankind, at least not too ambitiously. I agree if there are certain things that are going terribly wrong, maybe there is a case for adjustment, just like you were saying about sometimes data does make a difference and there are real hazards. So there's exceptions. But anyway, I'm babbling. Any other questions?
Dobrý deň, ja hovorím po slovensky. Po anglicky by to bolo zle.
Sorry, I gotta do this. Thank you.
Ospravedlňujem sa, ja budem po slovensky. Ja sa opýtam možno tak veľmi naivne cez príbeh slovenského školstva, a teda vidím, že to je problém v celom svete. Školstvo sme mali veľmi direktívne, otvorili sme ho alternatíve a stalo sa nám to, že na Slovensku máme napríklad až jednu demokratickú školu, čo je teda hanba na jednej strane, na druhej strane zachytávame narastajúci a nezanedbateľný počet rodín, a teda detí, ktoré sú vzdelávané bez ohľadu na fakty, alebo teda nie na základe faktov, ktoré podajú konšpiráciám, dezinformáciám, extrémizmu. Tuto vlastne sa nám ako keby, čo mňa desí, neoplatil ten voľný trh. Zatiaľ to tak vyzerá. Čo by na to povedal Smith, aké by mal riešenie a čo si vy o tomto myslíte, o takomto trende?
Thank you. I get the topic that you're raising. I'm not quite sure I get the description of the situation in Slovakia today. And maybe someone who knows English can answer me on that. So is the idea that there's been allowed some voucher system and some... Not in Slovakia. Oh, so it's not a question about... the Slovakia experience. It's about other countries where there are vouchers and choice and private school provision. Yeah.
Na Slovensku sme mali iba štátne školstvo, bol komunizmus. Neskôr sme sa otvorili alternatívnym školám a teraz, hlavne od pandémie, máme tisíce detí vzdelávaných mimo štátneho školského systému, úplne bez kontroly štátu. To sú deti vzdelávané v skupinách a školách, ktoré vznikli z podnetu z dola a sú úplne mimo štátneho vzdelávania.
I think I get it. So it's not that there's vouchers. If a person in Slovakia wants to send their kid to a private school, they have to pay twice. They have to pay for the private tuition. And you're unhappy with what some of the private schools are teaching students.
Even
Okay.
homeschooling.
What's that?
Even homeschooling is a problem.
And there's homeschooling too going on.
Yep.
And you don't like what some of the parents are teaching. So what are some of the parents teaching? What is it that's being taught at some of the schools that you don't like?
Poviem úplne konkrétne príklady, pretože v tom pracujem. Napríklad, že holokaust nebol a dejiny sú vymyslom elít. To sú klasické konšpiračné teórie. Ďalej tu máme obrovský ruský alebo prokremelský vplyv, ktorý učí, že Západ a liberalizmus je obrovský problém. Ďalej máme deti, ktoré sa neučia vôbec matematiku, gramatiku, dejiny. Oni sa učia iba, čo chcú, tzv. Unschooling, ktorý vymyslel Petra Gondu, alebo teda pomenoval. Ja sama učím deti formou unschoolingu, ale na Slovensku sa nám unschooling zvrhol na zanedbávanie vzdelávania. Týchto detí je stále viac. A spolu s riaditeľmi niektorých škôl, ktorí vlastne tieto deti majú povinnosť preskúšať, neustále uvažujeme o tom, že čo s týmito rodinami, že či tá tvrdá ruka štátu, pretože sme presvedčení liberáli a až libertariáni, či tá tvrdá ruka štátu tu už nie je na mieste v rámci nejakej záchrany ďalšej generácie.
Well, I don't know how it looks on the ground. I don't know how much schools are telling people the Holocaust didn't happen. You really think that's being taught at a number of schools, that the Holocaust didn't happen?
Yep.
That's pretty wild. I am disturbed by that. I'm a little puzzled about why there wouldn't be correction to that teaching, in that parents, once they learn that their students are being taught these things, which are, you know, pretty readily refuted.
Rodičia vyžadujú, to sú homeschoolery alebo školy, ktoré zakladajú.
So how many Slovakians say the Holocaust didn't happen? I mean, inform me. Is that common among the parents here? How many? What percent?
Na východe máme školu, na ktorej je zapísaných vyše 600 detí v homeschoolingu. Odhad je, že tretina z týchto detí, a to sú deti pod kontrolou štátu, sa učí vlastne takýmto spôsobom alebo neučí. Ďalšie čísla nemáme, ale v občianskom združení, ktoré združuje homeschoolerov, to odhadujeme na 40 až 50% rodín, ktoré vo menšej alebo väčšej miere vzdelávajú deti buď teda o holokauste, alebo v extrémizme, vo fašizme, alebo s láskou ku komunizmu, alebo teda mimo faktov. Čo sú teda stovky detí, predpokladáme, a teda príde mi to veľmi závažné, aj keď sú to len stovky, ale je to jedna generácia už takto poškodená.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure what to say. You speak of there perhaps being hundreds of children in all of Slovakia being taught this way. Well, that's bad. On the other hand, what about the good that certain private schools are doing? I mean, are you proposing to centrally control the curriculum at all? What are you proposing? And what are the consequences of what you're proposing? You got to take the good with the bad. So it becomes, you know.
To je tá moja otázka. Pretože mňa desí tá silná ruka štátu vo vzdelávaní, pretože my nemáme zrovna funkčné školstvo, najmä pre deti zo special needs. Takže ja by som sa veľmi rada vyhla riešeniu, v ktorom by sme išli násilne na to, ale myslím si, že nejaké riešenia pre vlastne tento zlyhávajúci systém potrebujeme. Kto iný, ak nie štát, teda sa pýtam.
I'm not sure, but maybe it's something for civil society, for private organizations to somehow try to approach and appeal to these parents who demand this bad teaching, person to person. I mean, if it's a couple of hundred students, it's maybe not that hard to sit down with a lot of the parents. I don't know. I don't know.
Ak môžem, my organizujeme napríklad webináre, ako učiť dejepis. Ten záujem je nulový o týchto rodičov.
Ešte posledná otázka, kto má záujem, nech sa páči, last question. Tam vzadu vidím, tam vzadu, last question.
Thank you for your presentation, and I would like to ask that if Adam Smith lived today, and we've seen during the last 2.5 centuries that the economics developed a lot, it became a science, we have now a lot of economists and a lot of research, would he change his stance and opinions regarding certain matters or regarding certain policies that he defended in the 18th centuries under these new developments?
Great question. I think, first of all, like I said, I think he's actually a pretty kind of temperate guy who is more situated with respect to the status quo of wherever he finds himself. So if he moved forward into our world and found himself in our status quo, I don't necessarily think he would be telling us to abolish everything, because I don't think he believes in super radical and widespread change and reform, drastic overnight, even if he thought that an awful lot of what the government does today, it should not be doing at all. I don't think he'd necessarily say, scratch the whole thing. But I think, again, I do think he'd be talking in the same direction. I think he would be appealing to us in the same direction of less government, reducing, and so on. I don't think he has this funny endorsement of usury restrictions in the Wealth of Nations. What does that mean? There were, at the time, caps on interest rates about the interest that a lender could charge a borrower. And he endorsed those. And why he endorsed those is a little bit strange, to put it mildly, and there's different theories about that. And I certainly think he wouldn't say that today, for example. So that's one exception to the liberty principle that he made, and that I don't think he would bother making today, where we don't generally have those kind of caps, so he wouldn't feel too bold to just say, yeah, no, it's fine not to have a cap. But I'm not sure what else specifically he endorsed that would be different. There was no very little welfare state redistribution back then, and that's obviously a huge part of our political world. And what exactly he'd say about that is debated by Smith scholars. Some people say he'd lean this way, some people say he'd lean more that way. I think he would lean against it, generally. But basically, the message really is, from me to you tonight, is it's still true. Adam Smith is still true. And so basically, I think he'd be the same. I think he would be favorable to the classical liberals or the conservative liberals today, and pointing in the same kind of direction. of allowing every man to pursue his own interest his own way.
A teda náš čas sa naplnil, takže ja už som na záver povedal 4 veci. Prvá vec je teda, že vás pozývame na čašu vína, ktorou môžeme si symbolicky pripiť na výročie Adama Smitha, 300 rokov od jeho narodenia, teda podľa starého kalendára. Druhá vec, ktorú chcem povedať, a teda do pozornosti, že zajtra organizujeme ďalšiu prednášku manželky pána profesora Charlotte Stern, ako funguje švédsky trh práce, takže kto máte záujem, zajtra môžete prísť aj na jej prednášku. Zároveň vám dám do pozornosti, že si môžete kúpiť knihu Teória mravných citu so zľavou 30%. Vidím, že niektorí už máte. Využite tú možnosť, pán profesor tam napísal predhovor a možno vám ju aj podpíše. A teda posledná vec, ďakujem vám, že ste prišli. Ďakujem našim partnerom za pomoc a spoluprácu. A ďakujem pánovi profesorovi za jeho prednášku a diskusiu. Thank you very much for your presentation. Takže čaša vína, nech sa páči, na Adama a na Smitha.